All right. Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us for working with a data equity lens. We're very excited for you to be here. I'm going to continue admitting people to the room. As you join, please keep your microphone muted, your camera off. And as you're coming into the room, please introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us your name, your position, and where you're from, and we will get started. So thank you very much for joining us, working with the data equity lens. We're going to start things off with a brief introduction and a welcome, a little discussion about Project Unicorn. And then I'm going to turn things over to Jenny Bradbury, who is going to talk with us more about digital promise and data equity, and followed by some question and answer at the end. At the same time, there will be multiple pause points throughout the presentation where you can ask questions of Jenny about data equity and digital promise. So be on the lookout for those moments. When those come up, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. And we will go that way through the rest of the webinar. I'm Jonathan Barry-Wolf. I work with the Project Unicorn team on setting up these webinars and marketing and communications. And Jenny Bradbury is the Director of Solutions, Strategy, and Growth over at Digital Promise. Very excited to have her here with us today. Before we get started, I want to talk about Project Unicorn. We're an organization dedicated to advancing and implementing data interoperability in K-12 EdTech tools. We have a pledge that you can sign for school districts and for EdTech vendors that basically shows that you are dedicated to interoperability. And once you sign the pledge, you become able to access a lot of resources, webinars, and one-on-one technical assistance with the Project Unicorn team to help you along the interoperability journey. So the links to those pledges should be in the chat. Please sign up. We'd love to work with you. Additionally, EdTech vendors, we just released the Project Unicorn Interoperability Certification in partnership with Digital Promise. It's a free certification. You fill out a survey and it ranks the interoperability of your EdTech product. You will get a badge like the one you see on the screen, ranked from tier 1 to tier 4, and some customized help and assistance from Project Unicorn to get yourself going on that journey. So another link should be in the chat for that as well. Please fill that out. It's an excellent resource. Finally, just to make sure we're all on the same baseline understanding here, we define data interoperability as the seamless, secure, and controlled exchange of data between applications. And that's the definition we'll be working with. And from this point on, I am going to pass things over to Jenny. Jenny.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. As Jonathan mentioned, I am with Digital Promise. My title is Director of Solutions, Strategy, and Growth. What that means is that I work with school district teams on R&D projects and help them think about what the best solution is to their challenge, and then I help try to get those solutions out into the world. And so this work comes from a project that we've been doing with generous funding from the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. We have run a couple of cohorts with school districts who were interested in learning about and building their capacity around applying an equity mindset to their data and also increasing their ability to make their data interoperable. So starting off with a definition, I am just going to play this video for us briefly, which does, I hope, a good job of explaining what we mean by data equity. And Jonathan, I don't know if you can play it on your end. It's not playing for me, but.
Yes, give me 1 second and we will make sure this works.
When we look through a red, blue, or green filter, we can sometimes see different things. But by combining these colors, we can get a clearer understanding of what we're looking at. Data works the same way. You need a complete set of data in order to gain visibility and develop an accurate story. However, your data on its own may not allow you to understand how practices and policies create inequitable conditions. Biased data and interpretation can create inaccurate assumptions about a student's learning abilities and experiences. To have a complete understanding of a student, we need data equity. Data equity applies an equity-centered lens and mindset to ensure data is collected, analyzed, interpreted, and shared with diverse stakeholders without bias or exclusion. To center equity, we need to consider who is involved when collecting, working with, and making decisions based on data. Schools and districts should ensure that representatives of all stakeholder groups, including community partners and those who have traditionally been marginalized, have a place at the table. To ensure every child has access to opportunities and the support they need to thrive, we must acknowledge our existing inequities. Data equity can help us do this, while also designing and implementing more equitable programs and systems. Join the Digital Promise League of Innovative Schools in the movement to harness the power of data in education through data equity and interoperability.
Thanks, Jonathan. And so I'll move us on if you want to pull the slides back up, and then, oh, there we go, perfect. So that video and this infographic are both available on our website. You just saw the URL, and we'll make sure you get it. But the goal of data equity, as they said in as the video says, is really to think about how data, how equity applies to the full life cycle of data. So often, you know, school districts will bring together diverse stakeholders at the interpretation or even the sharing stage of the data life cycle, but we are really advocating for thinking about making data equitable and inclusive from the very beginning. So when we talk about data collection, it's looking at, you know, who's doing the data collection, who is developing the measures and instruments to collect that data, and how is it being collected? Are we asking people to come to us, or are we going to them in a and collecting that data in their environment where they may feel most comfortable and where we may be most best situated to get honest answers? A lot of data collection in education is very transactional, and so we don't necessarily get the honest answers from diverse stakeholders, and we often don't hear the voices of folks who are furthest from opportunity. And so we really believe that it's critical to think about inventive ways to make sure that we are hearing from the entire community and accessing their voices and including them and helping us to think about the best ways of doing that. When it comes to data analysis, again, we want this to be an inclusive process. So it should be folks from across stakeholder groups who are helping to look at the data together. And disaggregation can be really, really important in understanding exactly what is going on with particular subpopulations of students. We often miss really important clues and information about not just what's happening, but why it's happening when we don't disaggregate the data. Also, we think it's really important to include both qualitative and quantitative data. This is a conversation that I'm hearing more and more in spaces where I am with other folks, recognizing that the qualitative data helps us understand why things are happening. So we've prioritized quantitative data like test scores and performance on performance tasks and attendance data. That can tell us what the trends are, but it can rarely tell us why those trends exist. And so some of the districts that we've been working with, they describe bringing in that qualitative data as Interoperability 2.0, that it really helps them when they bring in student climate and culture data, when they bring in focus group data, to understand in a much more nuanced way why particular equity gaps may exist within their system, so that they're then better able to address those gaps. With data interpretation, again, it's about having the right people at the table. I've heard really great anecdotes from districts about how differently they interpret data when they look at it with a group of adults and then they look at that same data set with a group of students. And so thinking about how you can bring in students and talk to them about data, bring in parents and talk to them about data, they may help you see patterns in the data or help you understand what's underlying the patterns in the data in ways that you might not expect. And so having that diversity of voices and perspectives can be really critical. And then data sharing is really thinking about who owns the data and who has access to the data. So making sure that the data, once it's collected, is shared and is in the hands of all stakeholders so that it doesn't feel like a transactional or extractive process, but it feels like a process where there is shared ownership. And last but not least, data-based decision making. The more that we can demystify that, the more that we can open that up and invite diverse stakeholders to be part of that process, the more likely we are to end up with equitable decisions that meet the needs of the full community, and particularly that don't overlook the needs of students furthest from opportunity, who have traditionally been placed at the margins. So that's kind of data equity in a nutshell. And we've been working with a cohort of 13 districts this year to help them apply this equity lens to their data so that they can both understand where inequities exist within their system and also problem solve around how to address those inequities. And since this is a Project Unicorn conversation, we always want to talk about interoperability and what's the connection between the two. So when we first started this data equity work, we asked a bunch of folks, can you do data equity without data interoperability? And some people said flat out, no, you can't. And other people said, well, you can, but it's an incredibly time-consuming process because you're trying to integrate all of that data manually, and that is not sustainable or scalable. And so what we have been doing in the work with these 13 districts is helping them understand how to take their diverse data sources, both qualitative and quantitative, and bring them together so that they can get that whole child, whole family understanding of what's happening within a school building or within a district so that they can then make really informed decisions. And so that is we think these two pieces go hand in hand, that you can do data interoperability without data equity, but that it's very hard to do data equity without interoperability because you really need to look at all of that data together in order to be able to understand the patterns and the root causes underlying those patterns. So I will pause there for a moment because I know that was a lot of information to throw at you, and see if there are any questions. All right, hearing none, I'm going to keep trucking because we only have 30 minutes together today. So on the bottom of this slide, you'll see some of the really interesting use cases that have emerged as part of this work that we're doing with districts. Some of them are asking questions, as it shouldn't be surprising at all, about access to technology. So we talk about digital equity as well as data equity and whether students have the access they need. And obviously that has been of critical importance with COVID and so many students having to make transitions between learning in person and learning at home. But we also have some more unexpected use cases. So one of our districts is really trying to look at what's happening at a systems level to create inequity and whether the transportation service that they're providing is having a negative impact on attendance and achievement amongst particular subpopulations of students. Another district is looking at supplemental funding, so funding that's being raised by parent school associations or parent teacher associations, or that's coming into schools in other ways, trying to understand, is that actually working against the efforts that the school district itself is making to create equitable learning experiences across its schools? And if so, the school district then may be in a position where they want to have a conversation about reallocating some of their own funding so that the outcomes are more equitable for students, regardless of what building they might be attending in. And then we have a lot of folks who are looking at overrepresentation of specific subpopulations of students, Black boys, ELL students, students with disabilities, both for disciplinary referrals and for special education referrals, trying to understand whether the decisions that are being made in the district are being made based on good and holistic data, or whether maybe they are too quick to make decisions about students' abilities and opportunities without looking at a more robust and integrated set of data. So those are some of the really interesting and important questions that folks are asking when they are thinking about data equity and interoperability. And one of the districts that we have the pleasure of working with is Pennsbury School District in Pennsylvania. You can see on the left their challenge statement. So they were really looking at this question of overrepresentation of subgroups in special education and remedial programs. And they were saying this, as I was speaking to earlier, it's very hard to do data equity without interoperability. It was just very cumbersome. It was taking far too much staff time. And that staff time that could be better spent actually analyzing and making decisions around data rather than crunching numbers and having to pull together data from numerous spreadsheets. And so what they wanted, their solution was to develop a district-wide interoperable solution that would allow them to pull that data into a dashboard or a series of dashboards so that they would have all of that data available at their fingertips and in a format that would enable them to quickly identify patterns so that they were then able to have conversations about how to address inequities where they saw them. And so this next slide is an example of what their solution looks like. So you can see on the left, they have a lot of different platforms that they're using. This data is coming from a variety of different sources, and they're looking not just at quantitative, but also wanting to pull in qualitative data from climate culture surveys. And they're using Qualtrics as the platform where they're going to integrate all of that data and manage all of that data in order to be able to then create some powerful visualizations for key stakeholders and decision makers. And so this is a mock-up of what that looks like. They're able to look across their student population and get some basic demographic data very quickly and easily and see trends over time. And then here they're able to see proficiency in mathematics and algebra specifically broken down by specific student subpopulations. So are there patterns emerging based on students' socioeconomic status or based on race or based on whether or not they have an IEP? And so this is taking data from multiple sources and making it much more accessible for this particular district. So how did they get there? Well, they are using our Data Ready Playbook. So the Data Ready Playbook is a website that we developed a couple of years ago and have been iterating upon ever since. And essentially, it is a curriculum or a scope and sequence that helps a district team go from an awareness of data interoperability to readiness to actually implement a data interoperability project. And this past year, because we've added an emphasis on data equity, it also has lots of resources within it that explain what data equity is and that walk teams through what it looks like to actually implement data equity practices. So there are data equity audits that teams can use. There are a series of different resources that teams can apply to their data to help them kind of look for patterns that they might not look for if they didn't know how to ask equity-focused questions about the data. And we start the journey towards interoperability with data and project governance. So Project Unicorn last year introduced the school data survey. I know it's not that I'm missaying that. The school system data survey, that's what it's called. To see if we could get kind of a handle on, what is the state of affairs in terms of interoperability within districts. And what they found is the area of greatest need was around data governance, that districts were saying that they just did not have good structures and systems in place around their data. And so the journey of getting to data interoperability through our playbook starts with a focus on data governance and project governance. And there are lots and lots of resources within the playbook that are designed to help district teams think about who needs to be who needs to be a data steward. Who are the people within the district that need to be making decisions about how data is structured, accessed, stored, et cetera. And then how do they, what are they working with, right? So this early chapter has teams actually create a landscape and workflow document that helps sort of outline all of the existing data sources and, how they're connected to each other. So it's the playbook is designed to be a very practical, hands-on resource that a team can come into and use to help get them ready for interoperability. And it actually starts with a diagnostic. So, Jonathan, can we pull up the playbook itself? And so if you'll scroll down, you'll see on the left hand, it says getting started. And that is where we have a diagnostic. And what the diagnostic does is ask a series of questions about where your district is in doing this work. And based on your answers, it will then give you a recommended set of resources. So if your team has already completed some of the work of getting ready for data interoperability, it will recognize that and will provide you with a recommendation of where in the playbook to start and what particular resources in the playbook will be of most value to you and your team. Because we know everybody is in different places on their journeys towards interoperability. And so we want to make sure that we are pointing folks to the most relevant resources and being respectful of your extremely limited time and all of the many priorities that we know educators have on their plates. So I will pause. I saw a comment in the chat. Yes, I would be very happy to connect directly with folks. Because I know we don't have a lot of time here. And so I'll put my email in the chat. So if anybody wants to follow up with me directly, please don't hesitate. You also have the link to the Data Ready Playbook there, but let me stop talking and see if folks have questions or comments.
Jenny, one question I've been thinking about through this webinar is based on your experience both with the data equity cohort and also folks who are going through the Data Ready Playbook. What are some of the most common challenges, particularly when it comes to data equity and working with an equity lens, that you find folks having?
I think the biggest challenge up front is creating connections and relationships between people within districts who don't always tend to work together. So for our data equity cohort, we asked the teams to identify two co-leads. One who is sort of a technology lead with decision-making power. So that's the CIO or the CTO most often. And the other who is charged with working in, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so in some cases, that's a curriculum person. In a lot of cases, that is somebody who heads up an office of diversity and inclusion. And those folks don't always tend to work together. They don't always tend to think about the connections between their work. And so it's doing this work around data equity has been an opportunity for folks to come together and really think about what the connections are or lack of connections and talk about how to really leverage data more effectively in order to be able to achieve the district's goals around equity and inclusion.
Thank you. Thank you. And then along those lines of like bringing people together who might not otherwise work together, who all should be involved in going through the data ready playbook itself?
So we've really advocated for them creating teams of key stakeholders, but waiting until they've identified their use case to pull together the full team. Because in the instance where the team is looking at the relationship between transportation, attendance, and student performance, they've had to pull together a team that draws people from the operations side of the district and people from sort of the curriculum and instruction side of the district, and people, well, sort of from central office, all coming together, each of whom kind of has a specialty area to talk about, where these three pieces come together and how they can manage them together. In the case of folks who are working on disproportionate referrals, often they're pulling in teachers, they're pulling in school counselors, they are pulling in parents in some cases, because they're trying to understand from all of those different stakeholders' perspectives why this problem exists and what potential solutions would best meet their needs. So we encourage people to pull in diverse stakeholders throughout the process, but to really to start with a couple of co-leads, and then they do a needs analysis early on to understand kind of where the pain points within their system are, and that will lead them towards identifying a particular challenge that they want to solve, and then that particular challenge often helps them determine who needs to be at the table.
Thank you. I think I saw a raised hand in the chat and the participants. If you have a question, feel free to unmute your mic and ask away. And we'll give a couple seconds here for questions.
Michael J. here from Matchmaker Education Labs. Thank you so much, Jenny, and all the hard work of Digital Promise and Project Unicorn. I look at the use cases, which I find incredibly valuable, and think about it from a vendor's perspective as well. Because I think so often it's hard for them to get a vision of the breadth of needs and the opportunities that exist there as well. Do you have any outreach for vendors at all to make sure that they're really in sync with the needs of the local implementations?
That's a great question. So we do, through our connection with Project Unicorn. So we are one of many organizations on the Project Unicorn Steering Committee, and one of our areas of focus this year is going to be outreach to vendors to make sure that we are helping to build bridges between vendors and school districts. Part of this work, our current cohort is actually wrapping up later this week, and all of the participating districts are going to be sharing out their stories and kind of their use cases, the work that they are doing to address those use cases, and kind of next steps and lessons learned. And we're going to turn all of those into kind of snapshot case studies that we'll then share with the community broadly. So practitioners as well as vendors, to try to give everybody insight into, what are the problems that school districts are trying to solve, and also, what are some of the solutions that this group of school districts has landed upon in order to help them address those challenges.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all for attending. We are at time, but Jenny put her email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out with any additional questions you have about data equity, the data equity cohort, or the Digital Ready Playbook. Additionally, here is the Project Unicorn Twitter handle, as well as Jenny's Twitter handle. Please tweet us any questions you have about data interoperability, equity, or anything else we talked about today. And finally, please register for our next webinar, Bite-Sized Fundamentals, Data Governance Policies, and Interoperability, on February 2nd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That's going to be a great conversation with Kosin. And so we look forward to having you there. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Jenny, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks so much.